China outlines its diplomatic priorities for 2020. We will take a closer look at the country's foreign policy. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. China is holding its most important political event. The annual two sessions meetings, delayed because of the coronavirus pandemic, outline the country's domestic and foreign policy agenda. The virus is also causing changes in the diplomatic arena, bringing China closer to some countries, but also causing rifts with the United States. We start with this report from CGTN's Zheng Yibing.
This year's political meetings in Beijing come amid the ongoing global pandemic and COVID-19 dominated Foreign Minister Wang Yi's press conference.
The virus cannot defeat humanity. We will eventually prevail.
China has given an additional $50 million to the World Health Organization since March. It's also promised $2 billion of international aid in the coming 2 years. China has also sent medical supplies to more than 150 countries and international organizations, and has sent 24 medical teams to various countries. Wang Yi stressed the interconnectedness of the world.
The most important thing we can learn from COVID-19 is that life and health of people in different countries have never been so closely connected. Also, it has never been made so clear to us that all nations live in the same global village and that humanity is in fact a community with a shared future.
In Europe, voices are divided about China's assistance, while some are also concerned about the future of China-US relations.
It is most regrettable that while the coronavirus is still out there, a political virus is also spreading in the U.S. and jumping at any opportunity to attack and slander China. China and the U.S. should and must find a way of peaceful coexistence and mutually beneficial cooperation, demonstrating that this is possible between two countries with different systems and cultures.
Wang Yi cited examples of cooperation between countries. Russia was among the first to respond to China's request for help at the start of the outbreak. Wang Yi compared the China-Russia relationship to a solid fortress and said China would like to work with Russia on economic recovery. China has also had close communication with its neighbors Japan and South Korea. Wang Yi said the three countries will focus on joint efforts to resume production. Wang Yi said China's aid will be heavily focused on developing nations, especially in Africa. And he backed measures to relieve the debt burden of African countries.
We know that China's aid cannot meet all the needs of every country. We also understand that some political forces have fabricated negative interpretations of China's intentions. But that does not disturb us, because China has never provided such aid for geopolitical purposes or its own benefits, and China has never attached political conditions to its aid.
Chinese President Xi Jinping says the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed many problems with public health systems. He says the world needs to support the role of the World Health Organization in fixing these deficiencies. And Wang Yi says countries need to both support the WHO and listen to what it has to say.
What we are seeing is that those countries that heeded and followed the WHO advice are more successful in bringing the virus under control, while those that ignored or rejected its advice are paying a heavy price.
The pandemic truly shows us the world is a community of the shared destiny. As President Xi says, only through united coordination can all nations address their common challenges. And China will continue to pursue peaceful development and advance friendships and cooperation with other countries to promote world peace, stability, and prosperity. Zheng Yibing, CGTN, Beijing.
Time to bring in our panel right now. Here in Washington, D.C., Sourabh Gupta is a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. From Singapore, via Skype, Bert Hofman is the director of the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore. Also via Skype from Bangkok, we're joined by the geopolitical analyst and author Pepe Escobar. And CGTN's anchor, Zou Yue, joins us from Beijing. Welcome to all of you. Zou Yue, let me start with you. As we just heard in that report, the Chinese Foreign Minister and State Councillor Wang Yi has outlined the very broad contours of Chinese foreign policy. What is your assessment of his foreign policy priorities?
Well, Foreign Minister and State Councillor Wang Yi basically said that China believes in multilateralism and global trade. And China wants to be a responsible stakeholder in this. And of course, China cannot do it alone. China needs the partners on the same page. But unfortunately, sometimes the partners of the Chinese not only tipped on the toes unintentionally, but also trample on our feet and poke fingers in our face. And that doesn't help. With the exchange of information with other countries at the outbreak of the COVID-19, actually a lot of countries benefited from this international cooperation. For example, Japan and South Korea exchanged information with China and also mutual aid with each other, and that helped. They have provided an exemplary track record of containing this disease and mitigating its effects. But unfortunately, with the same information, some other countries didn't make it that way. This is unfortunate. But I think China's message out there is that we believe in international cooperation. This is a world that we should be in this together and work against common prosperity.
Bert Hofman, as we just heard there, we have the two big powers in the world, China and the United States. China, as Zou Yue just told us, believing in international cooperation, believing in cooperation and connectivity. But on the other hand, we have the United States, which has become more inward-looking, talking about an America First policy. How has the coronavirus pandemic changed these big power priorities in terms of their economic plans?
Well, look, in the short term, I believe, unfortunately, that the nationalist tendencies in countries around the world have been reinforced. And the United States, being in the middle of an election campaign, has chosen this as a big topic of the campaign, and that's not helpful. In the medium term, I do think the COVID-19 or epidemics, the threat of epidemics, will have some consequences for the division of labor across the globe. I think there will be more emphasis on resilience, more emphasis on the strength of countries in their health systems and in addressing these type of epidemics, because this won't be the last one. How exactly that will work out remains to be seen. But in this context, those countries that have done well in combating the virus will look good in terms of being a future investment destination.
Bert, during the era of globalization, we've seen very large movements of workers across the world. Do you think that will continue, or will countries now not be so keen to bring workers in from the outside?
Well, in a way, it's too early to tell, but there is a tendency, I think, to look more at production at home. But I think soon, if you look at the numbers, you'll see that actually it will be far more expensive to shift a major part of production that is currently internationally divided back to the Western countries or the richer countries. So I think in some areas the economy will change, especially in critical goods areas such as medical equipment, such as medicine. But in other areas, things will remain fairly much the same.
All right, let's bring in Pepe Escobar. Pepe, we heard the foreign minister tell us that there would be a very strong emphasis on cooperation with developing countries, especially in the countries of Africa. That's where China would focus its development aid, and there's also going to be efforts going to be made to relieve a lot of those countries of the debt burden. How significant is this?
It's very significant because the international organization of China from now on, post-COVID, it has to focus on the global south, especially. This means partners across Asia, of Latin America is too far away, and Africa is absolutely essential for Belt and Road. The problem is we are in the middle already of a Cold War 2.0. Foreign Minister Wang Yi, which is one of the absolute top diplomats in the world, he says we are on the brink of a new Cold War. It's already on, and it started months ago, and it's official Trump administration policy. And it's also part of the national security strategy of the United States. What this means, the breakdown in realistic terms, day to day, is that the United States is going to interfere in every aspect of China or reorganizing the global economy and putting the global supply chains back on track. And that includes, of course, the developing world and in Africa. Don't forget that the #1 US policy in Africa is not trade, it's AFRICOM, which is a militarized operation, which means interfering in diverse African nations' internal affairs. So China has to be very, very careful, not only in terms of reorganizing many of the Belt and Road projects and getting Africa on its side in terms of more and more of win-win situations, and not having any possibility of being criticized because these projects are going to lead to a debt trap among African nations.
Sourabh Gupta, let me get your thoughts on that, on what Pepe Escobar just told us, that we are now in the midst of a Cold War. We've seen relations between the United States and China really morph from robust trade and economic relations now to a lot of tension. Do you think we're in the middle of a Cold War right now?
We might be entering a Cold War. We should hope that we don't get there, but the potential of that arising cannot be discounted. Of course, in its national security strategy, and in fact, even in a report to Congress this past week, or sometime thereabouts, the White House said that China and America are great power competitors, and it is laying the ground for that competition. Of course, both sides are still very intertwined, and while the US is trying to loosen some of that intertwining so as to be able to treat China as an adversary, I think, in my view, if China can continue its economic reform and liberalization of its domestic investment and trading regime, we might still see the US and China intertwined in a very significant way across many realms of economic activity, except perhaps in very core foundational technology cooperation, which I'm afraid is going to be decoupled. So it's still early in terms of whether we are in a Cold War or not. We have to see who the next president is going to be in the United States. But we should not discount the fact that this might be looked at the moment, say a decade hence, as the time when a Cold War really did start. But I wouldn't say, but it's not for certain, frankly.
Bert Hofman, what are your thoughts on that? Is there enough common ground between these two countries so that they will have some kind of meaningful relationship in the future?
Well, first, I mean, the starting point is very different. China delivers about 15 to 20% of the U.S. imports. In the old Cold War days, there was hardly any trade between the blocs. So the integration is now very, very different. Second, there's lots of common grounds. And yes, there's been the trade dispute. There's now a tech dispute. I would not want to call this a Cold War yet, because there's still simply a lot of areas where the countries can still work together. The pandemic being one, and actually before the pandemic broke out, there was quite a close cooperation on health issues and health pandemic preparedness. So many other areas, global warming, the international system is actually that China is joining. Yes, they want to have some changes, but it's actually the architecture is the United States. So there is a lot of common ground still, and I would think it's too early to call it a Cold War.
Zou Yue, let's look a little bit closer at this relationship, the relationship between China and the United States. As we are all aware, it's going through very rough waters right now. Our colleague Jim Spellman, who is a CGTN correspondent, has been looking at this. This is his report. Let's watch.
China-U.S. relations began the year on a positive note when President Donald Trump and Vice Premier Liu He signed the Phase 1 trade deal at the White House. But that was mid-January, and by then, COVID-19 was already spreading, bringing new challenges to the relationship between the world's two largest economies. Trump has repeatedly criticized China over its handling of the pandemic.
I'm not happy with China. They should have stopped this at the source.
A move critics say is meant to draw attention away from his own mishandling of the crisis.
Whether it's the loss of jobs, the loss of competitiveness, now the deaths from COVID-19, Trump doesn't take responsibility, but rather tries to blame China.
The two sides have traded attacks over the origin of the virus. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has at times claimed the virus may have originated at a lab in Wuhan. China rejects this, and Pompeo has presented no evidence. Earlier this year, a spokesman from China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs tweeted that the virus may have begun in the U.S., perhaps brought to China by American military officers.
The question I raised on my personal Twitter account was a response to the stigmatization of China by some U.S. politicians, and also reflects the indignation of many people in China.
Beyond COVID-19, other conflicts are simmering. The U.S. has taken steps to limit the ability of Chinese journalists to operate in the U.S.
The U.S. is continuously ratcheting up political suppression of the Chinese media, which will seriously undermine normal reporting activities of Chinese media in the U.S.
Beijing has responded, taking action against U.S. news outlets in China. The Trump administration has continued to target Huawei, taking steps to limit the Chinese tech giant's ability to operate in the U.S. and elsewhere. And though a military clash between the two countries remains unlikely, the U.S. Marine Corps is shifting its focus on China, and the Pentagon continues to occasionally send warships into the South China Sea on so-called freedom of navigation missions. Political observers say Trump's attitude toward China is largely about election politics.
The Republican Party has issued a 57-page memo, a guide to Republican senators and Republican House members on how to win the elections, and the key is to blame China.
While it may seem like good short-term politics for President Trump to criticize China, long-term, the two countries have more to gain from cooperation than from confrontation.
China-U.S. cooperation in various fields, including economic and trade, investment and technology, is mutually beneficial and win-win in nature.
Jim Spellman, CGTN, Bethesda, Maryland.
And so, you know, during Sunday's news conference, Foreign Minister Wang Yi talked about a political virus that was attacking and smearing China. We know what that was a reference to, but how do you see this unfolding in the months ahead? Do you think it's going to get a lot worse as the U.S. election gets closer to us?
Well, it totally depends on what we do, because some things won't change overnight. For example, America will still buy $500 billion of goods from China, and China will buy more, probably $200 billion, $300 billion in the coming years. But what seems to be happening is that there is a worrying sign. We understand that the current American administration is trying to blame China. This has been a consistent message from the U.S. because it's politically convenient. But what worries the Chinese is that it seems that both parties, the Republican and the Democratic Party, are trying to play the bashing China game because it wins political points. And that could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because you keep feeding this narrative of China is actually the reason why America is going wrong, be it trade, be it the loss of jobs, or the efforts to contain the epidemic, then people tend to believe it. And that will be an animal that has its own life, and that will force your hands when you are trying to make major decisions in a crisis, like what Lyndon Johnson did in the Vietnam War. He didn't believe the winnability of this war, but he didn't want to make America lose a war against an enemy in Asia, and then he was forced to add more forces to Vietnam. And that could also happen to what is going on between China and America, and that is very worrying.
So do you think it will escalate, that it will get worse than Zou Yue?
I think it will probably escalate in this election year. Both the Chinese and Americans don't want to back down on those major decisions,
right,
especially those concerning national security and trade.
Pepe Escobar, you wrote a really interesting piece which I read, an article in which you say that China and the United States are now engaged in what you call a hybrid war. Explain that to us.
Well, hybrid war is a concept that comes from U.S. think tanks. And it's very interesting because until recently, they were blaming the Russians. And now they are totally engaged in a hybrid war against China, which is land, sea, cyberspace, outer space, biological, propaganda, you name it. So obviously, we won't have a hot war in the near future because this has already been gamed by the Pentagon. Same thing against the Russians, and the results are catastrophic. Same thing with Iran, by the way. But the problem is when you have the top people around Trump, Steve Bannon, invisible, and the visible ones like Peter Navarro, Pottinger, etc., telling the president that China, 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 literally, it's the campaign theme for a re-election. And you have the whole complex, the industrial, military, surveillance, media complex buying into it, and bipartisan buying into it as well. They are painting themselves into a corner. And I agree, it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if it goes on like this, now it has its own momentum already. Most of the United States population is absolutely xenophobic as we speak, and it's going to get much, much worse. And there's no way out. They painted themselves into a geopolitical corner. And China has options. Belt and Road all across the global south. Better relations with the European Union and specific countries inside the EU. Not only Eastern Europe, but a key, let's say, swing country, which is Italy. Relations between China and Italy are excellent. And I get it from Italy directly that they cannot stand anymore being hostages of the United States and of the European Union as well. So Italy is looking at China with, the possibilities are immense ahead.
Sourabh Gupta, the United States announced on Friday that it will be adding 33 more companies and institutions to its China blacklist, the entity list. It's already imposed restrictions, we know, on companies like Huawei, for instance. What impact will this latest action have?
Up to a point, not excessive impact. The reason for that is this is mainly to a blacklist for companies which are providing services to the PLA, to the military. And it was always understood that companies which are in bed with the military in a significant way, I'm not just talking in terms of certain, which have light linkages to the military, were always never going to be parties to cooperation, technology cooperation with the Americans. But I think there's a larger and more important point out here, and unfortunately a damaging point. China is in the process of doing its industrial policy and industrial subsidies reform. It's at a very early stage. It's trying to marketize the process by which private companies live and operate and do not depend on government support and government subsidies. Now, for that to happen, one requires a market to function properly. And if the United States is going to place companies on the entities list and deny that market exchange, it will necessarily require the Chinese government at its end to become that much more involved in industrial policy, particularly in the high technology arena. So the unfortunate factor about the entities list is that it can work against China's own liberalization program in the area of industrial subsidies and state-owned enterprises. And that will hurt China, and it will hurt advanced manufacturing and high technology cooperation between the US and China, which frankly has immense potential, but can also get hamstrung and decoupled, unfortunately.
Bert Hofman, what is your view on the vaunted trade deal that President Trump signed with Chinese leaders, phase one of the trade deal at least? Is that in any kind of jeopardy right now?
Sorry, I was muted. Meeting the commitments from the Chinese side is a pretty tough affair at the moment. China, like others, are economically affected. Growth will be far less this year than it was last year. So meeting the import commitments is going to be a stretch. Now, China has reiterated the commitments, and it would be great if they meet it. But there remains some room, if you want, in the agreement itself, there is some room for negotiations in case the commitments are not made. In the medium term, I think this is a phase one deal. A lot of the difficult issues, such as that were just mentioned, subsidies, industrial policy, state enterprises, and how to deal with those, yet need to be addressed, and that's not easy in the current climate. But maybe China can take some initiatives and find other fora to find ways to address some of these domestic reform issues, but also to bring them into international agreements and bring these commitments in those areas into international agreements, for instance, with the Europeans.
Zou Yue, I've only got less than a minute left, but I want to talk about Hong Kong. Foreign Minister Wang Yi also addressed China's stance on the draft decision on national security legislation for Hong Kong. There were protests in Hong Kong over the weekend. What's going on there?
Well, what went on last weekend is actually what has been going on for almost a year. Those protesters couldn't reconcile their identity, being a citizen of Hong Kong, a metro cosmopolitan city, and also being a Chinese, because the passage of national security law is a common thing for anybody in the world. It's just whether you agree that you are a citizen of the Chinese. That wouldn't raise any eyebrows in the world. The issue is that national security has been used and excused by the US to punish Huawei. But on the other hand, when national security issue happened in Hong Kong, they say,
right,
whatever you like. That's really hypocrisy at its worst.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.